Session is being recorded. We will be sharing the recording out to everyone through our YouTube channel as well. As you file in, we'd appreciate if you could please mute your mics. We have a large group that we're expecting today, and we just want to make sure that we limit the background noise. Although knowing Dr. Bethany, she'll make this session interactive, and you'll have an opportunity to share and explore together. So again, my name is Golnaz Golnaragi. I'm social enterprise lead and mentor in residence, one of the mentors in residence at EDGE. And before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that for thousands of years, this has been and still is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, Anishinaabe Nation, Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Our campuses at Sheridan sit on these lands, and it's our collective responsibility to honor, respect those who have gone before us, those who are here, and those who have yet to come. We are grateful for the opportunity to be working on these lands, and I invite you to learn more about the history and the present of the Indigenous communities on the land you gather on and work to build a better future for all. And again, in the spirit of celebrating innovation and making our land acknowledgement practice meaningful, we would love to introduce you to a website called Whose Land that if you search, you'll be able to find, that allows you to look at the land where you live and work and learn about the treaties and agreements that have existed there. Okay. So quickly, our roadmap for today, after a little bit of introduction about EDGE, for those of you who may not know us, we'll do a brief introduction, and then the majority of the time we're going to pass on to our guest speaker today, Dr. Bethany Osborne, to do our presentation on fundraising strategies and grant writing for social enterprise. This is a two-part webinar. Today is the first, and the next one is on July 16th next week. We'll also have opportunities for Q&A with all of you and wrap up and close. So before we begin, I did want to ask everyone to please mute your mics unless you are speaking, just to reduce the background noise. We have a large group that we're expecting today. The session will be recorded, so please be mindful. In case you don't want to be on screen, feel free to mute your camera. And just be mindful about engaging in a way that makes you comfortable given the recording. We ask that you share any comments and ask questions using the chat feature. You can find a chat feature on the bottom of your screen. We will be keeping an eye and making sure that we address your comments and questions. And sort of on that point, I'm going to have my colleague Ahmad introduce himself. He is hosting our session today and will be moderating the chat with Bethany.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Imad. I work at EDGE as a project management coordinator for the summer on a co-op position. Yeah, I'll be moderating the chat, so please feel free to use the chat, especially during our Q&As. Also, feel free to use your video and audio. I know sometimes people can be shy, but we don't bite, so we welcome it. But if you'd rather use the chat, I'll be keeping an eye on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ahmad. And so again, a little bit about EDGE. We certainly have members here with us, and we have those that may have heard about this session through our website or other means. And so for those of you who don't know us, EDGE is Sheridan's home for entrepreneurs and change makers. And we focus on acting as a bridge into and out of Sheridan to our communities around entrepreneurship. We focus on connecting entrepreneurs to creativity and innovation expertise at Sheridan. And we also work to ensure that entrepreneurship supports are available. And we know, again, an inclusive approach to entrepreneurship has the power to positively impact the economy and society. And that's something that's very, very important to us as part of building an inclusive community. So at Sheridan, again, we have been in operation for over 2 years, almost 3, and have supported a number of ventures. I think the last count was over 150. And we are expanding into Brampton as well through our Davis campus. We support, again, entrepreneurs and change makers. We provide training, mentorship, Workspace when we do have access to Workspace, as well as support to access funding for our entrepreneurs and change makers. We serve our students at Sheridan, a very important demographic, alumni, staff, as well as the broader community. In terms of programming, we offer programming for all stages of venture development, from Explore, which is really that pre-ideation, pre-idea stage, all the way to Soar, where ventures are generating revenue, looking to scale and create efficiencies. So we are quite broad and diverse in terms of what we offer. In 2019, we served over 3,500 participants at 140 different sessions. So again, we are very active in the things that we do. I spoke about funding opportunities, and I wanted to give you a few examples of things that we've done over the last year. So we launched the Social Enterprise Innovators Grant in partnership with the Community Foundation of Mississauga. So again, we're very grateful for our partners and organizations that support us to be able to offer funding to our entrepreneurs. The Advantage Fund was another one that we recently, earlier this year, launched for our Rise and Soar members, where they received up to $10,000 in seed funding. More recently, we partnered with the Community Foundation of Oakville, Brampton, Mississauga, and a number of other community foundations on the Investment Readiness Program, which you may have heard about. And the first round closed earlier this year, and I believe announcements are being made imminently for those that have been successful in securing funding. And we do anticipate another round of funding through the Investment Readiness Program early this fall, likely September timeframe. So Sheridan will have information sessions about that coming up. So if you are interested and you identify as a social enterprise, please keep an eye out for those in a few months. So again, a reminder that today is session 1 of Fundraising Strategies and Grant Writing. Next July 16th, next week, we have part 2. And so if you haven't registered already for the second session, please feel free to do so after today. And I have the hyperlink to our events page where you can find other events that EDGE is also hosting, some of which are open to the general public, some are for members only. But it will give you an idea of the things that we do. All right, enough about EDGE. I'd love to now transition to why we're all really here. It is such a pleasure to introduce you to Bethany, Dr. Bethany Osborne. Bethany has been one of our advocates. When I started working at EDGE back in September and connected with her, I just want to say, Bethany, how much we appreciate how supportive you've been of us and our entrepreneurs and change makers, and just a really heart-centered individual. Bethany is certainly an innovative community practitioner, educator. She teaches at Sheridan, and researcher with over 20 years of experience building and engaging diverse communities. Over her career, she's worked with diverse organizations and enjoys a key role in supporting community transformation through innovative and creative program and project design, grant writing, and working with community leaders to develop dynamic projects that affect change and social change specifically. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Bethany. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so she can take over. Over to you, Bethany.
All right, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I am going to share my screen now. One moment. Let me just make sure I have. Just gonna. Okay. Okay. There we go. All right. So, so delighted to be here with you, and this is as Golnaz shared. This is the first of 2 sessions that we're going to be offering, looking at strategies for fundraising and grant writing for social enterprise. And it really was actually almost a year ago that we started this conversation. We started this whole journey back in March, just before we closed down. Before everything closed down, starting by talking about the context of social enterprise and the landscape. And today we're going to be touching very briefly on the context of social enterprise, just in terms of talking about the different types of funding entities that exist within social enterprise. But before we get started, I'm going to just start us off with just reminding that I am, sorry, one moment. I'm just realizing that I need to move into presenting mode, and I'm just going to turn on our closed captioning. Excellent. So you should be able to see now on your screen some live captioning at the bottom. This was some of the work that we were doing just at the beginning of our session, if you had checked in. Before we get started, there we go. I want to invite you. You should have actually seen, I asked Imad just to share a link to a tool called menti.com, and invite you to enter the first 2 or 3 words that come to mind when you think about fundraising or fundraising strategies. And this is just to give me an idea of how you're coming to our session today. And so I'm going to invite you to do that, and we'll come back to that in another few minutes. And so you can either click directly on the link that's in the chat, or go to menti.com and enter in the code 877010. And it's just the first 2 or 3 words that come to mind when you think about fundraising. Don't think too hard. There is no wrong answer. And just enter those words. So today we're going to talk about fundraising strategies and social enterprises, looking at determining the fit and things to do before you apply, steps to creating a strong funding application, what makes a compelling story, and taking a little look at fundraising in the age of COVID-19. And then drafting your funding strategy and your project story is where we're going to end our time today. So a number of the things that we will be talking about are thinking about identifying the different steps to creating a strong funding application, identifying different components that make a compelling story, and drafting different components of your fundraising strategy and your project story. So there are a number of different funding strategies that for social enterprises. And at the first session that I did back in March, we talked about a number of different sources that exist in social enterprises. You'll, as I look at this slide right here, we did a quick conversion to Google Slides just to make sure that we could actually do closed captioning at the bottom here. And so I apologize for that. There's a little bit of a mess with some of the formatting. I'll make sure that that's corrected in the slides that are uploaded for you as well. But we're not actually going to talk about, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about each of the different types of sources, but I did include on the Google Docs page the presentation and all of the resources that I provided in session 1. But there you'll recognize a lot of the different sources. So one of the sources is grants or corporate funding, impact investors, foundations, crowdfunding, different competitions. For example, the Philanthropitch. Golnaz mentioned a number of other different competitions like Advantage or the Social Enterprise Innovators Grant. Loans is another form of funding. One of the things that I introduced in my first session was also the first survey that was done of social enterprises in Canada, that was done in 2016, that looked at the different ways that social enterprises were actually funded in Canada. And you'll notice that many social enterprises, just from the graph that you see up here on the screen, were still funded from different government sources. Foundations, corporations, and individuals still serve as a very big funding source for many social enterprises. And then other funding sources serve as to support social enterprises outside of that. You'll notice that based on survey respondents, grants are still really the greatest source of funding through governments, foundations, and often corporations. So knowing how to create a really solid funding application is really significant when you're thinking about social enterprises. So the purpose of our time together is not to discuss specifically the best strategies for each of these different sources, though we could have a good coffee and discuss some specific strategies. And I'm always happy to meet with people to talk about a specific strategy around a specific funding source. But our purpose today is actually to talk about some of the things that are common to different funding sources that we've talked about. Because depending on your context, your project, and your scope, things are going to look a little bit different for each one of you. So I wanted to look at things that would be common and helpful as you are thinking about each of your different contexts. So I'm wondering if you can actually think about anything that might be common to all of the different funding sources that we've touched on. Are there things that you can think of that would be helpful, or that when as you've been looking at different funding applications, things that you think to yourself, gosh, this would be a really important or helpful thing or this is something that I found helpful as I've been approaching fundraising. So this is where I'll turn to you and ask you if there are things that you think are common across approaching different funders. Okay. So Imad, can you tell me some of the things that you're seeing in the chat?
Mm-hmm. So Farzana has said compelling story, attention to detail, thinking through the possible questions that the funder may have.
Great, wonderful.
Ryan said a detailed project plan.
Great.
Somaya said approaching with a plan. Sean says measurable impact.
Okay, great.
I'll add reasonable budget from Ryan. I think that's probably a big one too.
All right. Reasonable budgets. Excellent. For sure. Yeah, these are all very important. And thank you very much for your contributions. I think that you've touched on a couple of what I would consider to be very key fundraising strategies across the board. One is to develop strategic relationships. Another one is to tell your story well. And in fact, you'll see later on in these slides that I've actually used the word that Frizana used, which is compelling. So what makes a compelling story? And another one that I heard mentioned a couple of times about being planning a detailed project plan, and is to be consistent and to be organized. And so there are a few things that I want to talk to you about in terms of all of these pieces. So strategic relationships, I mean, we all know that things like networking are very important, and it's not what you know, but who you know. And you've heard about all of those things thrown around, and this is no different when it comes to thinking about funding. One of the things that's really important is actually thinking about connecting with the person who's actually administering the funds. When you're thinking about grants, this is often called the grants officer or the program manager. About 95% of grants, this is prior to COVID-19, 95% of grants have moved online. And so this means that we don't live in a world anymore where you necessarily have a lot of interaction in terms of the grants, in terms of the grant application process or the funding application process. And so, but what different funders have put into place are people called grants officers or program managers. And the same thing is true, not just with grants, but with funding competitions. So anytime that there's funding involved, there is always someone who is in charge of the funding. It was a gatekeeper for the funding. And so one of the things that that person does, and that person's job is to ensure that the process runs well, that the people who are applying know how to apply and how to put together good applications. They also are there to vet people as well and to support people. And so one of the things that you want to do is you want to ask questions about the way that the funding process works, invite your contact to learn more about you and your ideas as well. And what I've seen over the years is how important this relationship is, because as that relationship develops, as I'm the person who's applying for funding, I actually find out about things ahead of time, because the person who is the grants officer or the program manager lets me know when things are coming up. If I'm the person who's actually managing the grant, I know who I should let know about something that is coming up. So I've been on both sides of the coin, the person who's managing funds or the person who's applying for funds. And so those relationships become very important. You also want to do things like invite funders to special events to meet with volunteers or staff. There are lots of great ideas, and there are many people and many possibilities to invest, and you want to distinguish yourself and your idea. It also provides an opportunity for a potential funder to connect with the impact of your project and allows your project or your idea to speak for yourself. And even if this doesn't actually provide an immediate connections or funding, because sometimes it doesn't, and that can be discouraging. It's possible that if you've been in this game for a year or 2 years, and you've been engaging a little bit, but haven't gotten any funding yet, it can feel discouraging. But I would really encourage you to stick with it, because I really think that it's worth investing, because sticking with it and continuing to develop and cultivate those relationships is worth it in the end, because you never know when that one connection will make the right connection. And continuing to build your social network and your social capital is increasingly important in a world where there are not increasing pots of money, but where there are unfortunately shrinking pots of money, when particularly in this environment. So one of the, just to give you an example of what you might see. So the Ontario Petroleum Foundation is a foundation that I would absolutely encourage you to check out. They fund, they do a lot of funding and have a broad scope in terms of the kinds of projects that they fund. How do you? That's a great question. How do you initiate a relationship from scratch? Well, this is definitely one way. So so just taking a look at this here, you've got any grants or any foundation. So for an example, the Ontario Petroleum Foundation, on their website, they have a list of all of the different funding that they have available. Now, if you don't actually have a structure for your organization yet, you're just starting out, the Ontario Petroleum Foundation is not an organization that at this point right now, you're going to be able to apply for funding right now. Some of the type of funding that you're going to be able to apply for might be more kind of startup funding, so more competition type funding, like the kind of funding that EDGE is offering. But there are specific people associated with all of the competitions that EDGE is funding as well. So for instance, the Social Enterprise Innovators Grant, or AdvantEdge, or investment readiness. There is always someone who's associated. So you can, so for example, if you were trying to connect with someone at the Trillium Foundation, Trillium Foundation is huge. There's a 1-800 number to call, and they would connect you with someone. If you're thinking about local contacts for example, the investment readiness grants. This year, there was actually a contact through EDGE. And so you're always looking for who the person is who you would connect with. And you can actually cold call them, because that's their job. Their job is to make a connection with potential projects and potential ideas. And so I wouldn't even call it a cold call. I would actually call it a warm call, because that's actually the job that they're being paid to do. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay. And in terms of, it sounds, yeah, that's a great point. It does sound very similar to a job hunting strategy. So it's like a funding hunting strategy and finding the right connection. And it's about developing that connection. You're right. In fact, if I think about what I just suggested about making that connection and building your social capital and networking, that's often what you're doing when you're looking for a job as well. And it's very much the same. When you're given an opportunity to learn more or to engage in a process, you want to take advantage of those opportunities. For example, the Oakville Community Foundation's investment readiness program provided sessions and webinars, and so connecting with those as well. So in this environment where there are lots of webinars around, and you don't get to meet with people in person, that's also fine, because funders are very aware that when people are showing up to different webinars as well. So every funder actually, and this is something that's important for you to know, that funders are actually need to be accountable to their constituents as well. And so they need to be aware of who is coming to all of their events. And so they're going to know exactly who came to their events. And so it's so in a virtual environment, it's equally as important to make those connections, and it's equally as valuable as well. And once again, this was just another example of a connection, of making a connection through something like the Investment Readiness Program. And so the next piece is something that a number of you mentioned, was telling your story well. I'm betting that every single person here who's at this session today actually has a great idea, or probably has many great ideas. But just because you have a great idea, it doesn't mean that you know how to communicate it effectively, or that you couldn't be communicating it more effectively. So you really need to think about who your audience is and what they need to know about your idea, so that they can become as passionate about it as you are. So your story also needs to be able to convince them that you have the tools and the resources that you need to carry out what you have said you will do. It needs passion and creativity and innovation actually need to be partnered with consistency and organization as well. We're going to talk a little bit about developing that, actually a lot more about developing that story or that core narrative a little bit later. So I'm going to move on to my third strategic point.
Bethany, just to interrupt real quick. There's a question in the chat asking about a directory listing, which could give a list of funders to start with.
Yeah, sure. So I have a list. So I have a whole list of resources that's actually on the Google Doc, and that's in readings, so additional readings and resources. And so there are a number of like a list of different types of funders that are there as well. And so I'm happy to discuss, like to talk specifically about that later as well. So there are lists of different funders, and then there are also lists that you can purchase of funders. So there are funders, lists of funders, and then there are organizations like Imagine Canada who put together a comprehensive list of funders that you can actually buy into a database as well. So there are a number of different ways that you can approach that. And I think I saw another question flash up as well.
Was this in the Google folder link?
Yeah, so it's in the Google folder link. So there's quite a comprehensive one that I put together for the first session that I did. But then I put together a few resources in the readings and resources handouts for session 2 as well.
Perfect.
And I think I saw one more thing flash up in the chat as well.
Yeah, that was just Golnaz making sure that everyone knows it's in the Google folder.
Okay, great. Okay, fantastic. So in terms of the consistency and the organization, I think that maybe when you read that, you saw the strategy on the screen and you thought to yourself, boring. What kind of strategy is Bethany trying to sell me? But this strategy actually comes from years of reading grant and funding applications and wondering to myself, what is going on here? I can see the potential in this grant application, but this application is all over the place. There's so much potential. It looks like a great idea, but what's going on? So when you tell your story, your passion and your enthusiasm and your great idea is only going to get you so far. the details need to be really well organized so that when someone reads or listens to your story, they have a clear picture of what your idea or project is. Often the same thing, I say the same things to my students when I'm working with them, when they say to me, but I was thinking that when I wrote that. And I always say, well, you know, whether you were thinking that or not, if it's not on the page, I can't give you any marks for it. And the same thing exists when you are actually writing your story or telling your story. If the idea is in your head, if you were thinking about it, then it actually, if it's not actually on the page and if it's not clearly articulated, then you can't get credit for it. So when you're making a funding application, all parts of your funding application need to be consistent. So your whole project outline, your work plan, and your budget, they all need to be consistent and they all need to talk to each other. And you also need to be concise. So fewer words are better than many words. So you need to imagine that you are actually a funder who is reading many, many applications. And so you want to make sure that it's really clear in the beginning how the story is being, and that there's no guesswork in what you are communicating. So how do you determine the fit? How do you know where to apply and where to look and how to find the right kind of funding to apply for? So there are two ways that people or an enterprise or an organization come to write funding proposals. One, you have a great idea and you begin to look for funding that might be a good fit for your idea. Or you discover a great funding opportunity and you try to determine how your project or your idea might fit the criteria or the scope of the funding. And if you've been around for a while, this will probably resound with you. And I've written funding proposals from both of these different perspectives. So what is the best way to approach writing a funding application? Is it better to start one way or another? Well, I think it's probably better to start with option number one, to begin to look for funding that might be a good fit for the idea or for the project that you have planned. But unfortunately, that's not always the way that things go, because funding opportunities come in ebbs and flows. And so you don't always have an idea. You might have an idea, but funding isn't available at the time that you have an idea. And so when there's a funding opportunity that comes along, you need to think about how might my funding actually fit this particular opportunity. And so you've always got to have your story ready to go so that you can put together if the timeline is actually really tight. So how do you know where to apply and how do you know if it's the right fit? So you want to read through the request for funding proposals or through the criteria, and you want to read it really carefully to determine if it's the right fit for you and for your project or for your idea. You want to connect, like I said earlier, with a grants officer or with a program manager, and you want to let them know who you are and you want to let them know your intention to apply. Talk to them about the fits. You want to get their recommendations. This is a really key step. You also want to ensure that you meet the eligibility criteria. So this is where it differs very much from applying for a job. So if you saw a job application and the job ads had about 20 things there were 40 things in the job ad and 20 things in the job ad, you didn't actually have those qualifications. But you had 20 of the qualifications and you didn't have 20 of the other qualifications, would you apply for that job? What do people think? Yeah, so Golna says yes. Absolutely, yeah, of course. Yeah, I would totally apply for that job. Absolutely. So this is where applying for a job would actually differ from applying for funding. So if there is eligibility criteria, try saying that 20 times fast. It is really hard to say that really quickly. This is where it actually would actually differ from applying for a job. So if there is particular eligibility criteria for a particular grant or funding application, and you don't fit that criteria, I would advise you not to apply, because funders actually have particular, even if you have a compelling story and a compelling, wonderful application, they often, this eligibility criteria is often based on something that they have, some criteria that they have, or limitations that they have, or accountability that they have to a different to their stakeholders. So you just need to be very careful. I would talk to the grants officer, the person who's managing the fund, the program manager, before I would apply, if there are a number of the eligibility criteria that you do not meet. And I saw that there were a number of things that went up in terms of the chat.
Mm-hmm. So question one is by Sean. Are there business sectors that garner more attention than others? And moreover, are there funding sources with a preference to fund specific projects?
Yeah, I think for sure there are definitely different funders that have a preference for different types of projects, and like for instance, there are also other funders. So if you're looking at so there are criteria as well about how long you've been in existence, financials that you are able to show, what you're able to, because funders want to know that you're able to be responsible with when you've been given funds. And it can be really difficult to start out as well, because if you're not able to show that you've been in existence for a time. So, but there are ways to actually build your credibility as well. And there are different competitions and incubators that allow you to build up that credibility as well. So there are definitely ways to start building your credibility in the field, and different funds that are available. Certainly, once you've been around for a while and once you've built up that credibility, there are definitely more funds that are available.
Bethany, can I hop in here?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So with the question around, are there sectors that garner more attention, or are there funding sources with a preference to fund specific projects? Again, as entrepreneurs or social entrepreneurs, where we may have a not-for-profit or for-profit and really a clear mission, impact mission, what steps do you, like, how would we go about identifying what those funding sources are, and which ones may be more aligned with our intended social impact or the impact that we wish to have? So can you you talked about how there's a directory that you put into the Google folder, but starting out to get the lay of the land to kind of figure out which may be more aligned with what we're doing. Do you have any recommendations there for us to kind of figure that out?
So, I mean, I think that I'm not sure, like, in terms of figuring out exactly, I mean, I think that talking to people who are, I mean, I think that the one of the best strategies, I think, is to talk to people who are actually who are doing things in the field, like who are working in the fields that you are. So in a particular sector, I think that looking at a directory, and I mean, I think but like, I don't think that there's anything that, I mean, I think Imagine Canada's directory that they've put together definitely has, is divided into, like, is definitely is divided into sectors. Did someone say that I just lost sound?
I'm getting sound. Could we have people maybe put into chat if you can hear, type in a number 1 if you can hear me and us speak. Type in 2. Okay, so Farzana, if you've lost sound, you might want to log out and log back in, maybe.
Seems like 3 people have lost
3
sound.
people have lost sound.
Huh.
1 person has lost sound and visual.
Huh. I'm going to ask to see if you can.
Okay.
Yeah, please try signing off and signing back in and then see. Okay, Akela says she was started it and it works.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess what I will say, and we'll definitely have we're going to generate a transcript of the session after today. So if you've missed something, you'll be able to catch up on that as well. So we apologize for any technical glitches as well. But I think I'll keep moving along with apologies to those who have lost their sound. So I think that you can choose to invest in something like a database that Imagine Canada has, where they have funding divided into categories. But if you're looking to do things, but that's also making an investment in looking at, and you may not be at a place where you want to make an investment of that particular of that sort right now. For me, looking at and talking to and making connections with people who are working in the same field and the same sector that you are working in, and then determining what is going to be best sector-wise for you in terms of where to apply. Because you're right, it's so wide. Social enterprise is so wide. Ideas, and there are so many creative ways that you can also apply. So if you are doing something that is a great creative idea that is arts-based, you can look at funding sources that are around social enterprise, but would also fund something creative or arts-based. If you are doing something in the IT world, there are you're going to look. There may be things that are cross-sector that are social enterprise, but then are also specific to funding innovations around IT. So if you're like even thinking about what's happening right now around COVID-19, there are all sorts of funding that's available right now around innovations, around particularly marginalized or groups that have been particularly affected by the COVID-19 virus, and possibly your passion or idea might fit into that type of funding as well, in terms of being able to support a particular target population that is being impacted by the COVID-19 virus, right? So there are all sorts of ways. I think that being creative about where you are applying, and thinking outside of the box as well. But if you're wanting to invest, something like Imagine Canada and their database is a great is a possible idea as well. And I saw that Serena put a number of things in the chat as well. And if there is someone who specifically has a specific idea, I'm always happy to talk with someone about a particular idea and a particular strategy around your particular idea as well. Okay, I think I'm going to keep moving forward.
If you don't mind, could I just interject with one more question?
Yeah, please. Yeah,
It's
please.
from
Yeah.
C, and C also said they've lost sound. So I want to make sure their question gets answered. They could possibly see it in the transcript, so at least we get that out there.
Yeah, sure.
So C says many grants require 2 years of financials and and 1 or 2 full-time employees. Many startups don't meet this requirement. How do you overcome this requirement in order to apply for the grants?
So, so there are ways in which you can actually partner with. So, I have done this in a number of different ways. So you can continue to apply for smaller pots of funding. That's one option until you build up the financials is one option. The second option is to partner with an organization that is a nonprofit organization that that actually has maybe charitable status, and that they actually are the applicant for you, and that they actually manage the funds for you. Often they're actually your trustee. So it's a trustee relationship. And so they will often take, and this is a completely legitimate relationship in the eyes of funders. And they will often take an administrative fee for that relationship, because they're actually processing. They might be doing the payroll for your employees. They might be whatever cost that they do, but it's called a trustee relationship. So you can apply through them. So that's how you get around that. And I have done that in a number of cases historically in the last 2 decades, with different organizations and different projects and ideas that I have worked with. And it's always been, you always want to make sure that you have a good, trusting, working relationship with whoever you engage in that trustee relationship with. Okay, so before you apply, you want to make sure that you have a really clear picture of the scope of the project or part of the project that you are applying for funding for, what you want to do and how you're going to do it, the amount of funding that's required, and what the funding will be required for. And we're going to actually talk more about budgets and all of the different pieces here in terms of your work plan and how you articulate that in our next session next week. But I just wanted to park that here to say that this is really important. This is part of those details and that organization that is very important before you apply for any kind of funding. So the steps to create a strong funding application is that you want to develop a core narrative. Now, this is something that everyone who has a great idea or a great project should have. And your core narrative should be something that you basically have, you can draw on to apply for any kind of funding. So whether that would be a funding application that is a written funding application, or whether you're going to be doing something like a philanthropitch, where you need to create a 3-minute philanthropitch and you need to create some multimedia materials. You want to have a core narrative that is a compelling, exciting narrative that you can draw from and continue to use and for every funding application that you apply for. Your core narrative should include an interesting and easily readable summary sheet, but this is something that you should write at the very end. You should always write a summary once you have everything else done, which is why it's very funny that I should put that at the beginning. But summaries should be something that you have at the beginning, but it's something that you actually write at the end. So you want to prepare an introduction that conveys the credibility of your enterprise and your organization in a compelling manner. So how long have you been in existence? What have you achieved? You want to talk about the issue or the challenge that you're addressing. How will your enterprise or organization meet that challenge? What kind of research do you have to back up the need for your work? Are there external sources? Have you done market research? And you want to include all of those references. Your core narrative should also include what your goals are. How have you achieved them? What are your future plans? Who your target populations are, how your project or idea will benefit different populations, your target population and any other populations. And in this case, you want to be very specific. So when you're writing the narrative, you just say, X population will be happier. You want to use really measurable indicators. So what do you know about the benefits? What has your research shown you? And how will the world be changed because of your project or idea? How will lives be improved? What do you hope will happen because of the unique contribution your project or your idea will make? And the final question is really much more of an aspirational idea. So how will the world be a better place because of your project or idea? Now, I want to take just a moment and talk about the value of research. So I want you to look at the following two phrases on the screen. So the first one, option number one, is it's really important because people need to have access to mental health resources. And number two, the 2019 study completed by Said and Gomez suggests that access to mental health resources increases an individual's capacity to cope in difficult circumstances. So take a look at these two phrases, and I'm interested to know in which one of these phrases is actually more compelling to you. So in the chat, is it number one or is it number two? Okay.
Number two is
I said number two is winning. Okay, good. Yes, it is. I think it is, but why? Why is number two more more compelling? What is it in the chat again? Tell me why. So it's evidence-based. Okay. Okay, backed up with more evidence. It's specific. Okay, move from opinion. It's evidence-based. Excellence. Okay, it shows the research and by whom. Okay, yeah, great. Here is the value of including research in in your story, and why you always want to include research, and whether that is research that you conduct on your own, through your own market research, through your own work, through collecting informal research, or through external research, as you're doing a gap analysis in terms of what has already been done in this area. I can't tell you how many times I have received grant applications where people include phrases like, it's really important because people need to have access to mental health resources. That is something that I feel, absolutely. I feel this. I do think that people need to have access to mental health resources, but if I am going to give you money as a funder, I want you to show me why. I want it to be evidence-based. I want you to show me that you've done the work and that you are someone who has looked at evidence and that your project is based in evidence. So integrating research and small phrases like the 2019 study completed by Said and Gomez suggests that access to mental health resources increases an individual's capacity to cope in difficult circumstances, communicates something to a funder. It communicates, well, exactly what it says, but it also communicates that you are someone who does research, that you are someone who is driven by evidence, that you are someone who is potentially responsible and are going to be responsible with resources, and responsible in the way that you're going to conduct your project. So all of this, amazing that one little phrase like that could communicate so much. So you want to make sure there is more value to incorporating research into your story than just incorporating the research. So what makes a compelling story? What might a core narrative actually look like? So I provided a handout in handout number 1, and there's a, do people have access to the Google Drive? And can you look at the, are you able to see the handout?
I'm going to interject there and say the link would have been emailed to everyone through Eventbrite. It would have come through yesterday and then twice this morning. So if you refer to any of those emails from Eventbrite, if you didn't receive it, check your junk. Sometimes it's there. So let us know if you can't access the folder, but the link is in that email.
So would it be more helpful if I actually shared it on the screen here? Is that more helpful for people?
We're getting a message that people can access it, but why don't we have people share on the chat? Are you okay? Are you able to access it on your own? Or would you like me to share on screen? So just type in, okay, good to go, or share on screen.
Okay. All right. So, this is an example that is actually provided by the Community Toolbox, which is an excellent resource when you're thinking about grant writing. So it's one of the tools that I provided for you it's at the end of this PowerPoint and also on the Google Doc on the readings and resources. And I adapted this this case study and this application, this core narrative from a case study that was available on the Community Toolbox. And the reason that I chose to include this this particular case study is because of the way that, because I think it really does a good job of doing the following things. One, it provides a very good context. Oh, so I see that someone, okay, yeah, so I can share it on screen. So I'll just, okay, yeah, I'll share it on screen. Let me just exit this for 1 sec. So if I exit, we'll lose the
Bethany, you know what? Continue. I will get the link and I will share it with Sonia. Not to worry.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay.
Okay.
I just realized that would take down our okay. So it provides a context. It provides examples of past experience. It provides evidence as well. So research and quotes from community members that have been involved in the project. And that's part of that research piece as well. It looks at partnership, and it also looks at a big picture that is actually broken down into steps. And I'm going to, as part of so I'm going to leave this with you as an example of what a core narrative looks like, and what a good core narrative could look like. And we're going to just move on, because we're going to actually, I want to be able to spend some time with you actually talking about your own narrative. But I want to leave that with you as an example, and I just wanted to tell you why I provided that for you as an example. I always think it's helpful to have a model, not just so that if you're developing your own, you can look at what was valuable about a particular model. And so those are some of the things that I thought were very important about that model. So the next thing that's really important about creating a compelling story is knowing your audience. So Your audience is going to change each time that you complete a funding application, which is why it's important to have a core narrative, but to not just copy the same information every single time. So every time you complete a funding application or engage in another fundraising activity, you need to switch up or change or shift a little bit the way that you present your information. So this is why having the core story is important, because you can pull pieces of it, and you want to keep the facts of your story, but you might want to tell those facts in a different way depending on the funding criteria or the audience. One of my favorite poems by Emily Dickinson has a line in it that I have been quoting for probably 2 decades, which is, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." So you are always telling the truth when you are writing a funding proposal, but you're going to tell it with a particular slant. And that means that you're going to think about who your audience is, and you are going to tell it with a slant and with a particular framing and a particular lens that is going to connect with that audience. So if you have a particular way in which you, if there's something technical about, and there is jargon that you are going to use in terms of the way that you usually talk about your project, you don't want to use jargon. You want to speak to funders in a way that they are going to understand what you are talking about. So you want to make sure that you are speaking to someone who's not an expert in a particular area. If you know that, if you are going to be talking about something that is a specialization for focusing on working with youth, and there is a particular focus and something that is connected to youth, and you're going to use language that is very understandable to youth, then please use that language when you are talking with the youth that you are working with, but then make sure that the people who are, if you're applying to a established funding agency, it is very likely that not everyone on that adjudication committee is going to be youthful. And so you want to make sure that that the language that you use is professional language, and that people are not going to feel excluded when they're reading that funding application. If you are someone who is putting together a business plan, but you're applying to a nonprofit organization, you want to make sure that the business language is not going to throw people off. So you want to make sure that the language is identifiable by the people who are going to be reading your application. So know your audience, find out who they are. And once again, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but connecting with that person who's in charge of that program manager, that grants officer, that person who's in charge of that funds, you're going to get a good sense of the vibe of the adjudicators and that adjudication panel. So fundraising in the age of COVID. So I am not going to say that I'm an expert on this at all, but I was just aware that this was something that I wanted to learn about before talking with you today. And so you're going to find 3 articles at the end of this PowerPoint and in the readings and resources that I've put together as well. So what do you need to be aware of? Imagine Canada has put together a couple of different articles, and there are a couple of other articles that I found as well. You can't engage people in exactly the same way. Nothing we're doing these days is exactly the same way. If if this was 5 months ago, we'd be sitting in a classroom together and talking face to face. But how can you connect to what people are concerned with, and how does your idea meet current needs? And I alluded to this a little bit earlier today, even thinking about there may be new possibilities. So what are the new possibilities for you? It may be that you have a more captive audience. Virtual events can be really compelling and allow you to do things that you might have never been able to do before. I went a couple of weeks ago to a black tie event, and it was phenomenal as a fundraising event. People were asked to send recipes for desserts. People were asked to post recipes and pictures of their table. And they raised more money at that event than they have in previous years. Because people are also more attentive to different events. And maybe you've never thought of being able to do something because you couldn't bring people together, because you couldn't rent a big venue. But now you don't have to rent a big venue. You can do all sorts of things around fundraising or raising awareness. And so, although you can't engage people in the same way, there are new possibilities. And I think as people who are social entrepreneurs, this is an exciting space to be in when we are all in this virtual world. So I would encourage you to think about, take a look at those articles that I've included. There are all sorts of different and interesting ideas. People are so creative, much more creative, I think, than I am. And there are also all sorts of supports as well that are a part of the resources that Imagine Canada has put together as well. So I'm aware of time, so I want to keep moving forward. But this is definitely a space to be respectful in, and to also imagine new possibilities for engagement and for supporting communities. All right, now we get to the parts that is going to be partially. I want to introduce you to an activity that I'm actually going to give to you as some homework, which in all of our cases is really truly homework, because all of us are at home and will be at home truly. So handout number 2, and haha, it says handout number 1, but it really is handout number 2. It's always good to find a typo in the work that you've created. And so I've created another handout that's in the same type of format as the core narrative. It's saved as handout number 2 in the folder. Hooray! It might still say handout number 1 though. I will make the correction. But I put together, there are boxes in which you can enter in your own text. And what I've done is to create, I want you, maybe you've already got a narrative. You've competed in a philanthropy pitch, or maybe you've written a couple of grant proposals, or maybe you're in a space where you've got great ideas and you're wondering how to tell your story. Well, no matter where you're starting, there's always room to improve, and there's always room to tell your story more effectively. So this idea of starting your core project narrative or building on your core project narrative is very much what I would call an iterative process. So this is one of those words that you can take to your dinner table tonight with your family. Iterative process. It means that you can always be building more, and always be building on it. So handout number 3 has all of this in it as well. So you don't need to worry about even writing this down, because I've created another handout that has all of this information in it. So you want to have a project title. So your titles are really important. They should be clear and interesting. I have a colleague who's fantastic at titles. I always struggle with titles, but you want to have titles are what people read first. So you want to think about a great title. The next thing that you want to think about is you want to consider your context. You want people to get a clear idea of the value of your project and your idea. And so you can go back to the model that I gave you, but thinking about your own project and keeping that in mind. And your mission. So what are you doing? Why are you doing? And what are you doing? And for what purpose? When you think about your target population, what are the defining features of the population you're working with or targeting your work with? And once again, that whole project summary piece, when you finish writing your narrative, you want to write a summary of about 150 words that captures your key points, but that's the last thing you're going to do. And why do you want to have a project summary? Well, you want to have a project summary because people always want to see a summary of your project. It's also fantastic to put in an initial introductory email when you're introducing yourself to someone. So it's a useful thing to have. Next thing is, what's the challenge that you're facing, that your project or your idea is seeking to solve? So the statement of your community challenge. A description of your community. So who is the community that you're working with? And this is really different than your target population. It's broader. Who else is involved? It will include your target population, but also other stakeholders. This could be a physical community, it could be geographical, it could be an interest community, or it could be a virtual community. An analysis of your problem or challenge. So what's the root of the issue? What are the possible solutions? How will your project, your idea contribute to solving the issue? And your research should be included here. Your research can be included in all sorts of places, but it definitely should be included in your analysis of the problem or challenge. Your project vision and mission. What do you see changing if your project or your idea is successful? And your objectives. How will your project or your idea do this? And we're going to talk much more specifically about those two areas next week when we're talking about a work plan as well, and how you communicate that, because a work plan is a significant part of a funding application as well. And then, but you need this story to start that off. And then your project stakeholders. So who are the different groups that you're partnered with? Who will be working with to make the project a success? And funders love to see collaborations across sectors. So think about who it is that you're working with. And then your different project phases. So what are the different phases of your project? You may not be applying for funding for all the phases at the same time, but it's a good idea to chunk out the different phases and to have a plan about how they fit together and how they build on each other. And funders will often ask to see a larger plan, even if they are only funding a small part of the plan. You always want to have a very good descriptive piece of the different phases of your project. And because this is your core narrative, and because you're always going to be drawing out when you're putting together a funding application, you want everything to be included in this one document. And it may take some time to put this all together, but this is will be to you an invaluable document. I guarantee you, because having a document like this, each time that you go to write a new funding application, you'll be like, oh yeah, I'm going to go back to my core narrative and I'm going to pull from that to write my next funding application. So you're not reinventing the wheel every time. You're going to be pulling from the important work that you've already done, and you can make adjustments to your core narrative. But it's a very important document. So this week, what I would love for you to do in preparation for our work next week is I would love for you to fill in as much of your story as you can. Does it feel like a big job? Possibly. I saw, do you have permission to share the documents? Absolutely. Feel free to share them. 100%. And don't worry, this is just a process, and you're going to continue to build on this, and this is just the beginning. And next week, building on the work that you've done, we're going to start developing a work plan and developing a budget, and look at how those pieces fit together, and look at that, what we talked about in terms of that consistency and that organization, and look at how those pieces fit together. And by the end of our time together next week, you will have all of the pieces that you need to apply to develop any kind of funding application. So the core pieces that you need. So does measuring impact? 100%. And so that's a good question. And we will absolutely look at the measuring impact. That's something that is often included in a work plan. So often in a work plan, and work plans look a little bit different depending on the funding application that you put together. The work plan that's template that I'm going to give you next week, and I'll post it before next week, and you'll have access to the Google Doc. But it will be a generic template that will have everything that in my experience you'll ever need to have in a work plan, and it will include an impact. So it will include a measurement. Often funders will ask for, how will you know that you are having an impact halfway through your funding period as well. So all of those things, we'll talk about like verifiable indicators of whether or not you've been successful. So we'll talk about all of those different pieces as well. But definitely, impact is very big.
Bethany, can I interject here?
Yeah,
I think
sure.
that's a really important question. Do you think next week we'll have time to maybe even share some examples of here's the mission, here's the project, here's
You got it.
here are the benefits, and then here are some examples of how impact is measured?
Yeah. So
awesome. Thank you.
So I'm really big on showing showing models, because I think that that's a helpful thing. So I'll have a few different models of different types of projects as well, so that you can take a look at what those might look like, and as well as mission and vision statements, just so that you can take a look at those. There's a lot to kind of put into one session, so I thought this week we'd start with the story, and then next week we'll look at some pieces, and so you'll be able to take them away with you, and definitely be able to look at things that you can start building on your own as well, just drawing on some of the models. And to be honest, the way that I learned how to write grant proposals was to look at a grant proposal that someone else had written, and that, okay, all right, so someone else wrote that grant, so how would I adapt this to the proposal that I wrote? And I think that that's how you learn how to write well, is by looking at good models, and then adapting it to your own context. So
wonderful, thank you.
And there was I know that we wanted to have some time for question and answers at the end. And I want to apologize that I had this really fun tool with a Mentimeter, and realized that if I got out of the Google Slides, that I actually wouldn't be able to, that we'd lose our closed captioning. And so that was that was a technical issue.
Would you like to share it now?
So I can share it. I can share it now, but I thought that it was more important for us to have the transcript, or have the closed captioning. So what I will do is I will actually post the cool, and I'll make some remarks on the word cloud that you created through the tool. So you can even, if you didn't get a chance to participate in the activity at the beginning of the session, you can do that afterwards, and then I'll make some comments, and I'll post it for everyone to take a look at after the session. So I apologize for that. Sometimes things like closed captioning need to trump going out of a tool to look at another tool. But thank you everyone for participating in that, and I'll make sure that you all have access to it. And please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you. So we have one question on whether you have a template of a proposal that you can make available as a reference. That might be something you consider as a good example. And I recognize that, you know, we may need to anonymize or be mindful of
what's shared,
but if that was one question that's come through.
Sure. I mean, I could certainly provide, the reason that I chose to do like different pieces of proposals is because proposals look so different depending on what the proposals are. I have lots of proposals that I have written, but they might not be as useful depending on what the criteria for a particular funder is. But drawing from particular pieces is I think maybe more useful. But let me see.
Able to share maybe even an example of the narrative, like the compelling narrative.
A compelling narrative, sure. Yeah. So I could definitely share a compelling narrative, 100%, and of some difference. Yeah. So I shared the one narrative that is, but I can share a few more narratives for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is why we love working with you. Thank you for being so thoughtful in your approach and just providing all these amazing resources to
yeah, and no problem. My pleasure.
We have about 3 minutes left. What I would love to ask is, Deanna, I don't know if you have the link to the Eventbrite for next week, if you might be able to pop it in the chat. For those of you who would like to attend next week with Bethany to dig deeper into some of these pieces, please feel free to register so that you receive the details and that you can join us. So Sean asks, does access to one source of funding preclude me from accessing other grant funding sources? Are funding sources agnostic?
Generally not, but often a funder will ask on a funding application, are you planning to get funding from other sources? And you would need to indicate if you are planning to get funding from other sources, but generally it's actually a good thing. So say I was applying for funding from Source, from Edge, a funding source from Edge, but I was also applying from Trillium Foundation. I would actually indicate in my project budget, and I'll share this with you next week when we're looking at budgets. I would actually indicate that I anticipated getting funding, or I had already procured funding, and you would actually indicate that. There may be some sources of funding where they would only want you to get funding from one source, but I have never come across that type of funder before. Funders generally want to know that that you are well connected. However, I do not know all sources of funding. I'm thinking about maybe things like possibly impact investors or angel investors might be sources of funding where they want, maybe there's some intellectual property that exists and they want to be the only funder. But I don't know enough about those types of funding to be able to tell you definitively that would be true or not.
Great, thank you, Bethany, and thank you, everyone. We're at 11:30. Thank you for a great session. I'm going to ask Tiana to pop in our feedback form. Look at that, there it is. If we could please have all of you who are on the call copy that URL and provide us with your feedback for the session. Again, join us next week when Bethany will dig deeper into some of these pieces, and we look forward to having you join. Bethany, our sincere thank you for your time today and for always providing such practical, useful, helpful content. It really means a lot. And to everyone who was on the call, have a wonderful rest of the week, and we hope to see you on the 16th, same time, same place. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And just before we go, at the end of there's a bunch of different resources that I talked about. They're all the links are all at the end of the PowerPoint.
Awesome. Thank you
Okay.
so much. Have a wonderful day. We're
All
going to
right.
stick around for a few minutes until people log off, and we can stop the recording. And Bethany, again, thank you.
All right.